All right, so let me start today with something that sounds like the setup for a conspiracy theory. Imagine the President of the United States sitting somewhere far away from Washington. Maybe he's overseas. Maybe he's on Air Force One. Maybe he's just somewhere else entirely doing the actual work of being president. Meanwhile, back in Washington, a document is placed into a machine. The machine whirs quietly. A pen moves across the paper, and just like that, the President of the United States has signed something. No hand holding the pen, no dramatic ceremony, no photo op in the Oval Office, just a machine. Now, if that sounds strange to you, congratulations. You're reacting the way most people react the first time they hear about this thing. Because for most of us, the idea of a machine signing the president's name feels a little odd, to say the least. It almost sounds like the premise of some dystopian sci-fi story where robots are secretly running the government. But in reality, it's something far less dramatic and far more mundane. It's a device called an Autopen. For decades, the Autopen was one of the most boring administrative tools in the entire federal government. Nobody talked about it. Nobody cared about it. Nobody went on cable news to shout about it, for sure. But lately, this little signature machine has been dragged into a political fight involving Joe Biden, Donald Trump, and former Fox News personality turned federal prosecutor Jeanine Pirro. There have been investigations, there have been accusations, there has even been talk that presidential pardons might somehow be invalid because of this signature machine. And if your reaction right now is, wait, we're fighting over a machine that signs paperwork, then congratulations again. You're asking exactly the right question, because the Autopen itself is not really the story. The real story is about presidential power, revenge politics, and one of the most important lessons in government. Be careful what you ask for, because sooner or later, you might get it. Greetings, all. This is Your Neighbor on the Left, the podcast where we talk about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today we're going to be talking about the Autopen, more particularly Trump's obsession with Joe Biden's use of it. Now, that will be our main topic this week, but we also have a bunch of other things to talk about. We have new allegations about a Trump cabinet member, rising gas prices, and the unsettling war rhetoric that we're all hearing every day on cable news. It's a lot to get through, so let's just dive in. So a few days ago, a strange story started bouncing around the social media sphere and the internet itself. It had all the ingredients that make a political scandal go viral. There was a 73-page complaint. There were shell companies. There were wire transfers. There's even a luxury mansion worth more than $150 million. And right in the middle of the story is the sitting Attorney General of the United States. And the allegation was simple but explosive. Money was allegedly routed through offshore entities connected to a firm called Crescent Meridian Partners, then moved through a series of corporate structures and eventually landed in a trust managed by the husband of Attorney General Pam Bondi. And according to the complaint circulating online, all of this happened around the same time that a legal matter quietly disappeared. Now, if that sounds like the plot of a Netflix political thriller, You're not wrong. But here's the problem. Right now, the story exists in a strange gray zone. There are documents, there are claims, there are people analyzing them on television and social media, but there is not yet the thing that normally accompanies a scandal of this magnitude. There is no independent confirmation from major investigative journalism. So I want to talk about, we're going to slow down and talk about this and do something that's increasingly rare in modern media. We're going to walk through what's actually being alleged, what we know, what we don't know, and why this story matters even before we know whether or not it's true. So, the allegations currently circulating center on Pam Bondi, who now serves as Attorney General, after a long political career that included serving as Florida's top prosecutor. In recent days, a lengthy complaint has been circulating online. The document, reportedly around 70 pages long with supporting exhibits, lays out an alleged chain of financial transactions involving offshore companies, shell corporations, and a series of wire transfers. According to the complaint, funds were allegedly moved through entities associated with a consulting or lobby firm called Crescent Meridian Partners. From there, the money is said to have traveled through a series of intermediary companies before eventually landing in a trust connected to Bondi's family. The complaint claims that this trust is managed by Bondi's husband specifically. And the central allegation, the reason this document has attracted so much attention, is that the timing of these financial movements supposedly coincides with the quiet disappearance of a legal case that might have affected the parties behind those funds. Now, if true, the implication would be straightforward and deeply serious. A quid pro quo exchange where money moved in one direction and prosecutorial discretion moved in the other. But that word, if, is doing a lot of work here. Stories like this move fast online for a reason. They contain exactly the elements that make a corruption narrative feel plausible. First, the document itself appears very detailed. According to people who have viewed it, the complaint includes corporate records, property transactions, and references to wire transfers. When people see charts and exhibits and financial records, it definitely creates the impression of investigative depth. Second, the alleged structure of the scheme resembles patterns that investigators have actually uncovered in past corruption cases. When money moves through shell corporations, offshore entities, and trusts controlled by relatives, that's not a random storytelling device. It's a method that has been used in real financial crimes in the past. And third, the story has a clear narrative hook, if you will, the timeline. According to the complaint, the movement of funds allegedly lines up with the decision not to pursue a legal action. That kind of timing, money moving right when a case disappears, is the sort of thing that instantly raises eyebrows. It's the reason people online are describing the allegations as a potential payoff. But there is a major difference between a document that alleges corruption and a corruption case that investigators have confirmed. Now, one of the realities of modern political media is that documents themselves can travel faster than the process of verifying them. Anyone can assemble public records into a narrative. Corporate registrations, property records, LLC filings, trust documents, they're all often publicly accessible. Skilled researchers or political activists can gather those pieces and arrange them into a story that appears persuasive. Sometimes those stories uncover real wrongdoing. Sometimes they collapse once journalists and investigators start actually asking hard questions. This is why experienced reporters treat any document dump with caution. The existence of documents proves that information exists, it does not automatically prove any person's interpretation of those documents is correct. Now, the existence of the complaint has now begun appearing in political commentary, including discussions on the Rachel Maddow show. But it's important to understand what that means. Commentary programs often discuss emerging stories, circulating allegations, or newly filed complaints. That doesn't mean the host is declaring the allegations proven. It often means the story is being examined as something that might warrant investigation. In other words, the conversation is about the existence of the allegations, not confirmation of the allegations, and that distinction matters. One of the most significant facts about this story, at least so far, now I'm recording this on Sunday, so I'm not sure what will have come out between now and Tuesday when this episode drops, but one of the most significant facts about the story right now is something that hasn't happened. Major investigative outlets, organizations like, the New York Times, the Washington Post, ProPublica, none of them have yet published confirmed reporting about the alleged financial arrangement described in this complaint. That doesn't mean journalists aren't looking into it. If, in fact, the allegations contain anything verifiable, reporters are almost certainly trying to confirm it as I speak. But responsible journalism requires independent evidence, multiple sources, documentation that can stand up to scrutiny. And until that happens, the story remains in the category of unverified. So why are the stakes so high? Even though the story isn't confirmed, the reason it's drawing attention is pretty obvious. The Attorney General of the United States oversees the federal justice system. The office is supposed to represent the highest level of legal accountability in the country. So when allegations appear suggesting that prosecutorial decisions might have been influenced by financial arrangements, that rings a big bell that strikes directly at the heart of the public trust in the rule of law. It's the reason corruption accusations involving prosecutors are always treated so seriously. If the allegations are true, they would represent a profound abuse of power. If the allegations are false, they would represent a dangerous example of how quickly misinformation can circulate in the modern information age. Either way, I think the story matters. Now, another important piece of context is understanding what the word complaint means, at least in the legal world. People sometimes hear that a complaint exists and assume that prosecutors have filed charges. That is not necessarily the case. Complaints can be submitted by inspectors general, ethics watchdog groups, which I think was the case in this one, or regulatory agencies by private individuals or organizations. Filing a complaint means someone is making an allegation, and they're asking investigators to review it. It does not mean investigators have concluded that the allegation has any validity to it. In fact, many complaints are ultimately dismissed once authorities get to review the evidence. So the existence of a complaint is just merely a starting point for scrutiny, not in any way the proof of wrongdoing. Part of the reason stories like this spread so quickly today is that the information ecosystem has changed so dramatically. 20 years ago, allegations of corruption usually surfaced through investigative reporting. Journalists gathered evidence, confirmed it through multiple sources, and then published a story. Today, documents can appear online first. Social media users analyze them, commentators discuss them, and only afterwards, in some cases, do journalists attempt to verify any of the claims. The process has effectively been reversed. The shift means the public often encounters allegations before any of the evidence has been vetted. And that creates exactly the kind of gray zone that we're seeing right now with this. So, where does this leave us? At the moment, the situation can be summarized fairly simply. A detailed complaint exists that accuses Attorney General Pam Bondi of benefiting from financial transfers and that ended up in a trust managed by her husband. The complaint claims that those financial movements coincided with a legal case being quietly dropped. The allegations are serious, but they have not yet been confirmed by independent investigative reporting or by any publicly documented legal action. That means the story sits in a kind of investigative limbo. It may grow into a major scandal if the evidence emerges, or it may fade away. Now, given one other fact, and that being that Pam Bondi has now been subpoenaed by Congress to come and testify about issues surrounding the release of the Epstein files, and as we all know, many times is the case where the questions in a particular congressional hearing venture away from the stated intent, there is a very good possibility that questions about these allegations could come up when she testifies under oath before Congress. That could lead to maybe her taking the fifth on those questions. It could lead to what normally happens as of late, bluster and deflection and non-answers. But either way, the existence of these allegations could make those hearings even more interesting than they were already promising to be. But for listeners trying to make sense of this, the best approach is simple. Watch for verification. If the allegations are real, journalists will eventually confirm the financial records, identify the entities involved, and establish whether the timeline described in the complaint holds up. If that happens, the story will undoubtedly quickly move from speculation to investigation. If that verification never happens, it will tell us something important as well, I guess, because in the end, accountability depends on evidence, not rumors, not viral PDFs, but evidence. Stories like this remind us of something important, though, about democracy. Powerful officials should always face scrutiny. Allegations of corruption should never be ignored simply because they involve someone in authority. But scrutiny also requires patience and proof. Right now, the allegations surrounding Pam Bondi are exactly that, allegations. The real test will be whether investigators, journalists, or prosecutors can turn those allegations into something more concrete. Until then, this remains a story to watch carefully, not a verdict. There's an interesting thing about oil prices. You don't need to read an economics textbook. You don't need a Bloomberg terminal. You don't need a PhD in geopolitics. All you need to do is drive past a gas station. Because right there, glowing in giant numbers, visible from blocks away, is the price of crude oil translated into something Americans understand perfectly. Pain. Now, normally, when gas prices go up, politicians rush to microphones and promise to fix it. They blame the other party. They blame environmentalists. They blame billionaires. They blame Saudis. Sometimes they even blame windmills. But lately, we've heard something a little different. A shrug. A little, who cares? Which is interesting because for millions of Americans, rising oil prices don't just mean paying more at the pump. They mean paying more for almost everything. So I want to talk about the ripple effect of rising oil prices and why, when politicians act like it's no big deal, the average American tends to feel very, very differently. Oil is one of those things that quietly sits underneath the entire modern economy. Now, you may not think about it every day, but it's everywhere. It fuels our cars, it powers airplanes, it moves cargo ships across oceans, it runs the trucks that bring food to your grocery store. It even plays a role in making fertilizer for the crops that eventually become your dinner. So when oil prices rise, it's not like raising the price of one product. It's more like nudging the first domino in a very long line. And the first domino most Americans notice is gasoline. When crude oil prices jump, gasoline usually follows. Not instantly, but close enough that drivers start noticing pretty quickly. And here's the thing about gas prices: they are the most public price in the entire economy. Milk doesn't have a giant glowing sign visible from half a mile away. Eggs don't come with a billboard. But gasoline has a giant scoreboard on the corner of every major road in the United States. And when those numbers go up, people notice. For a typical commuter driving 30 or 40 miles a day, even a modest increase in gas prices can add hundreds of dollars a year to their expenses. For rural Americans who drive longer distances, it's even worse, of course, which is why when you hear someone like Donald Trump wave off rising gas prices like it's nothing, it tends to land about as well as telling people that their rent going up is just a minor inconvenience. But of course, gasoline isn't the whole story. Oil is the lifeblood of the global transportation system. The trucks on the highway bringing produce to your grocery store, diesel. The cargo ships hauling electronics across the Pacific, heavy fuel oil. The planes carrying passengers and packages across the country, jet fuel. All of that comes from crude oil, which means when oil prices go up, the cost of moving goods goes up too. And when the cost of moving goods goes up, businesses do what businesses always do. They pass the cost along to you and me. Sometimes it's obvious. Airline tickets prices raise, or they tack on fuel surcharges. Delivery companies add a few dollars to shipping. Other times it's subtle. Your groceries cost a little more. Your online order ships a little slower. Your next appliance costs $50 more than the last one. It's death by 1,000 tiny price increases. Now, here's the part that surprises people. Oil prices don't just affect the transportation, they affect agriculture as well. Modern farming runs on diesel-powered equipment, tractors, combines, irrigation systems, all of it. Fertilizer production also relies heavily on fossil fuels. Then, after crops are harvested, they still have to be transported from farms to processors, from processors to warehouses, from warehouses to grocery stores. Every step in that chain uses fuel, which means when oil prices rise, food prices rise. Sometimes there's a delay of weeks or months, but the relationship is very real. So when someone says rising oil prices don't matter much, what they're really saying is don't worry about gas, groceries, shipping, travel, or heating bills. It's a bold take, to say the least. Now, all of this stuff that I'm referring to is a statement recently made by the president when asked by a reporter about rising gas prices, and he said, "I'm not worried about gas prices." But I digress. Now let's talk about why oil prices rise in the first place. The one big reason is geopolitical conflict. Oil is traded globally, and a large portion of the world's supply flows through a narrow shipping lane in the Persian Gulf known as the Strait of Hormuz. About 1/5 of the world's oil passes through that corridor. So now that we're at war with Iran, tensions have risen in that region. Missile strikes, naval strikes, military escalation. At the very least, oil markets get nervous. And that's before there is any actual tangible impediment to the moving of oil. Even if no tankers are actually blocked, traders start pricing in the possibility that they may eventually be. And that alone can drive prices higher. which means a missile launch thousands of miles away can raise gas prices in Pennsylvania by the end of the week. Global markets are funny that way. Now, there's another interesting dynamic that happens during oil spikes. Energy companies tend to do very well. When oil prices rise sharply, companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron often report massive profits. And that leads to a debate that pops up every single time. Oil companies say they're simply responding to global market conditions. Prices rise because supply is tight and demand is high, and blah, 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 blah. Critics say companies take advantage of crises to raise prices more than necessary. Now, if you want to be fair, we'll say the truth probably lies somewhere in the messy middle. But one thing is undeniable. When geopolitical tensions rise, oil executives rarely panic. Their shareholders usually send thank you notes. You'll often hear politicians claim that America is energy independent, implying that global oil shocks shouldn't affect us. But that's not really how oil markets work. Oil is a globally traded commodity. Prices are influenced worldwide by supply and demand, including production decisions by organizations like OPEC. Even if the United States produces a lot of oil, produces it domestically, and it does, the price is still tied to the global market. In other words, we may pump a lot of oil here at home, but we don't live on an island. We're not disconnected from the rest of the world. When global prices rise, Americans feel it. Economists sometimes describe oil price spikes as a kind of hidden tax. Not a government tax, but an economic one. And like many taxes, it's regressive. Lower-income households spend a much larger percentage of their income on transportation and energy. So when gas prices jump, it hits them harder. A wealthy executive might barely notice a 50-cent increase per gallon. But for someone commuting long distances to a modest-paying job, that increase might be like choosing between filling the tank and trimming the grocery budget. That's why oil shocks have historically triggered more widespread economic slowdowns. They quietly take away spending power from millions and millions of households. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Voters often blame whoever happens to be in power for high gas prices. It doesn't matter that oil prices are influenced by global markets and wars and shipping routes and international production decisions and a variety of other factors. If the numbers on the gas station sign are high, people get pissed. And politicians usually understand that. Which is why it's so unusual, bordering on bizarre, to hear President Trump casually shrug off a question about rising gas prices. Because for the average American, those prices are a daily reminder of economic pressure. And the supposed lowering of gas prices, which, a lot of people argued about how much they were lowering, it's been a talking point of the president's all through the first year of his second administration. And it's not an abstract policy debate. It's right there on the corner for everyone to see. So oil prices are one of the few economic signals that everybody has access to, whether they want to or not. You don't need charts. You don't need reports. You just drive past the gas station. And when those numbers climb, they ripple through the entire economy. Fuel, food, travel, shipping, heating, everything in between. And the president treating oil prices like it's a nuisance question, it makes Americans tend to react the same way they would if someone told them that their rent and electricity bill were suddenly higher. But they should just relax about it. Because the truth is simple. You may not follow global oil markets, but global oil markets definitely follow you all the way to the gas pump. There's a moment I think most kids of a certain age will remember, particularly the boys, not to sound sexist, but you're sitting on the floor. Maybe it's a living room carpet, maybe it's your bedroom, maybe you're even outside, but scattered all around you are little green plastic soldiers. The paratrooper with the parachute, the guy with the bazooka, the one pointing dramatically forward, like he's leading a charge. And you make sounds, pew, 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 boom, boom, helicopters whirring, tanks rumbling. You narrate the battle in your head. The soldier dies. That one heroically charges the hill. That one, well, he just gets knocked over by accident and you move on. Because none of it matters. They're toys. The soldiers don't have names. They don't have families. Nobody is going to knock on a door later that day and hand someone a folded flag. And that's fine. That's what childhood imagination looks like. But here's the problem. Lately, when you listen to some of the most powerful people in the United States are talking about the current war with Iran, it doesn't sound like the language of serious wartime leadership. It sounds a little bit like the plastic army men are back out on the carpet. And that should worry everyone. The United States, of course, as you all know, is now involved in a direct military conflict with Iran. That's not a minor skirmish. Iran is not some tiny militia or a rogue pirate group floating around the Red Sea. It's a nation of nearly 90 million people with a substantial military, deep regional alliances, and the ability to respond in ways that don't always look like traditional warfare. Iran can strike through proxies, it can disrupt oil shipping lanes, it can launch cyber attacks, it can encourage terrorism. And it can do all of that while denying direct responsibility. In other words, this is exactly the kind of conflict that requires steady, serious, adult leadership. Historically, presidents and defense officials understand that. When Americans might die, when troops might deploy, when global tensions could spiral into something bigger, the tone coming from the White House and the Pentagon usually becomes noticeably sober. You hear gravity in the voices. You hear caution in the words. You hear respect for the stakes. But some of the comments coming from the current administration have sounded strangely casual, to put it mildly. And that casualness has a lot of people, including me, very uneasy. One of the most striking aspects of the public message so far has been the way the potential human cost of this conflict have been discussed, or in some cases, not really discussed at all. When you're talking about war, you're talking about lives. American lives, Iranian lives, civilian lives of people caught in the middle. War is not an abstraction. Every American service member who dies becomes a folded flag handed to a grieving family. Every casualty leaves a gigantic hole in someone's life that usually never gets quite filled again. That's why historically presidents speak about war with a kind of solemn respect for that reality. But recently we've heard remarks that sound less like someone contemplating the human cost of war and more like someone shrugging at it. That doesn't sit well with me, and it shouldn't sit well with you, because the men and women serving in uniform deserve leaders who understand exactly what they're asking them to risk. So just by way of example, a couple of the comments that I've heard that have stuck out for me, the president said, quote, "We have 3, but we expect casualties. But in the end, it's going to be a great deal for the world," end quote. Immediately turning the death of the first 3 American soldiers into part of the cost-benefit analysis. And then later he added, "Sadly, there will likely be more before it ends. That's the way it is. Likely be more." Now, at the risk of sounding cliche, I thought this was a tone-deaf statement on its face. But then if you try to put it into the ears of one of the family members of someone who lost one of those fallen soldiers, or someone who has a son or a daughter who is currently in harm's way, and the callousness of it is absolutely astonishing. Another moment that raised eyebrows came when concerns about rising gas prices were brought up. Now, as I mentioned in the previous segment, a war with Iran almost inevitably will affect global energy markets, and Americans feel that impact quickly. It's going to show up at the gas pump. It has already. It's going to show up in shipping costs, and it's going to show up in grocery prices. So when people ask about gas prices during this war, they're not being shallow. They're not being selfish. They're recognizing that global conflict has real dollars and cents consequences for ordinary families. When leadership dismisses those concerns outright, it creates the impression that they're disconnected from, the everyday reality that we are dealing with as Americans. People don't expect war to be convenient, but they do expect leaders to acknowledge its ripple effects. Pretending those ripple effects don't matter is not exactly reassuring. When asked about this very topic by Reuters, the president said, "I don't have any concern about it. If they rise, they rise. I'm sure they'll come down quickly after it's all said and done." Lines spoken by a guy who hasn't pumped a gallon of gas maybe in his life. Another moment that caught attention was a response to a question about domestic security. Reporters asked whether Americans should be concerned about potential retaliatory attacks at home in some shape or form. And the president's response, "I guess." That's the kind of answer you give when someone asks if it might rain later, or if you'd like a refill of your drink. It's not the kind of answer people expect from the president when discussing the possibility of terrorism or domestic retaliation connected to a military conflict. Americans understand that no leader can guarantee perfect safety. That's not realistic. But what people look for in these moments is reassurance and seriousness. Something that says, we're aware of the risks, we're preparing for them, we're doing everything possible to protect the country. A shrug does not inspire confidence. It suggests either uncertainty at best or indifference at worst. Neither of which is very comforting during a war. Another comment that has drawn criticism came from Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who criticized the media for putting stories about fallen soldiers on the front page. Now, let's pause for a moment. In a democracy, the public has the right to understand the cost of war. Not just the strategic cost or the financial cost, but the human cost. When American soldiers die in combat, those stories are front page news. They are front page news because they should be. Those lives mattered. And historically, the public visibility of casualties has been part of democratic accountability. It forces the country to confront the actual consequences of its military decisions. Trying to discourage coverage of fallen soldiers raises a troubling question. Are leaders worried about the impact those stories might have on public support? Because if a war is worth fighting, it should also be worth telling the truth about. Now, some defenders of the administration say critics are focusing too much on tone. But tone matters. Communication during wartime is not just about conveying information. It's about projecting leadership and confidence, and maybe most of all, seriousness. When the tone coming from the top sounds casual and dismissive, and dare I say cocky, in the case of these two gentlemen, it sends a signal both to the American public and to the rest of the world. Allies hear it and adversaries hear it. And so do the families of the troops who might be deployed. Those families are not thinking about political messaging strategies. They're not thinking about, how the war looks. They're thinking about the possibility that someone they love might not come home. They deserve leadership that reflects the weight of that reality. Which brings us back to those little green plastic soldiers. When we were kids, we could knock them over without thinking twice. We could invent battles and wipe out entire armies in seconds. But it wasn't real. This war is real. Real soldiers have names. They have spouses. They have kids waiting at home. They have parents and siblings who worry about them even though they're adults. Real wars have consequences that last for decades. Veterans come home with injuries. Some come home with trauma that never fully fades. Entire regions can be destabilized for generations. When leaders talk about war casually, it creates the impression that they're forgetting that difference. They're treating the situation less like grave responsibility, which it is, and more like a strategic game. And that perception is as dangerous as it is infuriating. Americans are not naive about war. They understand that sometimes military action becomes unavoidable. Now, I'm not saying that this particular instance was unavoidable. I'm just trying to emphasize that people aren't stupid. History is full of moments when force happened and force was necessary. But when those moments come, Americans expect something from their leaders. They expect seriousness. They expect empathy. They expect honesty about the risks and the costs. They expect leaders who understand that sending young men and women into harm's way is one of the heaviest responsibilities a government can carry. And they expect those leaders to talk about these things like they understand that. The United States is truly entering a major conflict with Iran. I don't think that that's a question at this point. And if I'm right, then the country deserves leadership that treats the moment with the gravity it deserves. Not casual remarks, not frat house bravado, not shrugs. War is not a television show. It's not a campaign rally. It's definitely not a tabletop game played with plastic soldiers. It's life and it's death. And when people in charge of the world's most powerful military start sounding like they're narrating a toy battle on the living room floor, it's reasonable for the rest of us to ask a very simple question. Do they understand the weight of what they're doing? Because if they don't, the rest of the world will eventually find out the hard way. All right, and that brings us to our main topic for this week, and that is the Autopen controversy. Since Trump took over in his second term, a recurring topic of his rhetoric has been the Autopen and accusing Joe Biden of using the Autopen for any number of things, and even threatening the idea that some of the pardons that Biden issued could be reversed because they were signed with the Autopen. So I want to talk about this Autopen and a little bit about what it is and the history of it, but I also want to talk about Trump's fascination with it and with Biden in general. So let's start with the basics here. The Autopen is, in essence, a mechanical signature device. A real pen is inserted into the machine, and the machine traces a programmed pattern that duplicates a person's signature. If you looked at the result on paper, you would almost certainly assume it had been written by hand. The technology dates back many decades and was originally developed for people who had to sign enormous volumes of documents. Celebrities signing photographs, corporate executives approving paperwork, politicians responding to thousands of constituent letters. Eventually, the technology found its way into government offices, and for obvious reasons. If there's one place on Earth where the paperwork multiplies at an almost supernatural rate, it's Washington, D.C. The President of the United States signs an extraordinary number of documents every year. Bills passed by Congress require signatures. Executive orders require signatures. Military commissions require signatures. Diplomatic correspondence, even routine proclamations and ceremonial documents all require the president's name. Over time, the Autopen became a quiet administrative tool of the presidency. One of the earliest presidents associated with this mechanical device was Harry S. Truman, who reportedly used them to help manage the enormous volume of correspondence that arrived at the White House. Later presidents continued the practice, and for decades, it remained a largely invisible part of how the executive branch handled its paperwork. And that's the key point here. It was boring. It was administrative. It was the kind of procedural detail that nobody outside the government ever really thought about, if they knew about it at all. It certainly wasn't the kind of thing that sparked political outrage or criminal investigations. Now, the Autopen first entered the national conversation during the presidency of Barack Obama. In 2011, Obama was traveling in Europe when Congress passed legislation extending portions of the Patriot Act. The bill needed to be signed quickly to prevent a lapse in certain surveillance authorities, but the president was on another continent, so the White House used an Autopen to sign the bill into law. For a brief moment, the practice sparked a constitutional debate. The Constitution says the president signs legislation. So some commentators asked whether that meant the president must physically hold the pen. The Justice Department reviewed the issue and concluded that the practice was constitutional. What mattered was that the president authorized the signature. The Autopen was simply a mechanical tool for carrying out the president's directive. Once that legal analysis was published, the controversy faded. The government continued using the Autopen just as it had before, and most Americans promptly forgot about the whole thing. For years, the device returned to its natural state, a boring administrative machine quietly signing paperwork. Which brings us to Donald Trump. During his presidency, Trump often held elaborate signing ceremonies in the Oval Office. Cameras would gather, lawmakers would stand behind him, and he would sign legislation with dramatic flourishes before handing out commemorative pens. Trump clearly enjoys the symbolism of those moments. But like presidents before him, Trump's administration also relied on routine bureaucratic processes to handle the daily flood of paperwork that comes through the executive branch. That meant that Autopen signatures continued to exist within the machinery of government under Donald Trump, just as they had under previous presidents. At the time, nobody treated this as controversial. There were no investigations. There were no claims that Trump's signatures were invalid. The Autopen was simply part of how the modern presidency operates. That detail becomes important later, because political arguments have a habit of forgetting inconvenient history. So now, towards the end of his presidency, Joe Biden issued a number of pardons and commutations. This is a long-standing presidential tradition. Presidents from both parties often use their clemency power in their final months in office. Some decisions are praised, some are controversial, but the authority itself is clearly spelled out in the Constitution. Some of Biden's clemency documents involved Autopen signatures, and that detail quickly became the focus of a new political narrative. Donald Trump and some of his cronies began suggesting that if Biden did not personally sign the documents by hand, perhaps the pardons were invalid. Perhaps they could be challenged. Maybe they might even constitute some kind of crime. Legal experts across the political spectrum were quick to note that this theory was, at best, extremely weak. The legality of the Autopen signatures had already been addressed. Multiple administrations had used them, There was no clear legal foundation for declaring the pardons void. But of course, that didn't stop the argument from spreading. Then enter Jeanine Pirro. Eventually, the controversy reached federal prosecutors, and that is where Jeanine Pirro enters our story. Pirro had spent several years as a prominent television personality and vocal defender of Donald Trump. When she became involved in examining Biden's Autopen use, critics immediately raised concerns that the investigation might be driven more by political motivations than legal ones. Imagine that. As the investigation moved forward, however, prosecutors quickly ran into a fundamental problem. There was no crime, at least no obvious crime. No federal statute requires the president to personally hold a pen when signing official documents. No law declares Autopen signatures invalid. And no precedent suggested that presidential pardons issued this way could or should be overturned. But even if prosecutors had somehow managed to invent a new legal theory, they faced another massive obstacle: the Supreme Court. In 2024, the Supreme Court issued a landmark decision in Trump versus the United States, dramatically expanding presidential immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts. Trump's legal team had argued that presidents must have strong immunity protections, otherwise each administration could prosecute its predecessor. I don't know about you, but this is how I like my irony. Now, the Supreme Court largely agreed. The decision established that official presidential acts enjoy broad protection from criminal prosecution, and issuing pardons is about as official as presidential actions get. The pardon power is written directly into the Constitution, which means the immunity doctrine that Trump fought to establish now protects every president, including Joe Biden. The irony here is so thick you could cut it with a knife. The legal shield designed to protect Trump from prosecution also protects the people he wants to prosecute. Now, there's a bigger lesson here. This story illustrates one of the most enduring truths about political power. When you expand authority for your own benefit, you expand it for everyone who comes after you. The rules you change today become the rules your opponents inherit tomorrow. Presidents from both parties have contributed to this dynamic over the years. Executive power expands incrementally, often justified by short-term political goals. But once that power exists, it rarely disappears. And that's what makes the Autopen controversy such a revealing and to my take, interesting story. The machine itself is trivial. It's a piece of office equipment that has existed quietly in government for decades. What matters is the political impulse behind the investigation. Trump has repeatedly suggested prosecuting his political rivals, including Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. The rhetoric reflects a broader shift in American politics towards treating the justice system as a weapon in party conflict. Historically, presidents have been cautious about directing prosecutions at their predecessors, and the reason is simple. Once that norm collapses, it becomes very difficult to restore it. Each new administration may feel justified retaliating against the last. Before long, politics becomes less about governing and more about settling scores. Which brings us to the final question. When will Donald Trump stop obsessing over past defeats? His rhetoric frequently circles back to old rivalries and old grievances. Joe Biden's name still gets mentioned more than any other in the rhetoric that Trump spews. And it doesn't even matter the subject of the speech. He can be talking about anything, anywhere, and he manages to bring up Joe Biden. Barack Obama is a close second. He still appears in Trump's speeches years after his presidency ended. For a movement that claims to focus on the future, an extraordinary amount of energy is devoted to revisiting past grievances. And the Autopen controversy is exactly that. A small administrative detail becomes a national controversy. A quiet piece of bureaucratic machinery becomes the centerpiece of a political outrage. But in the end, the story isn't really about the machine. It's about power, precedent, and the way political decisions echo into the future, because every new authority created today will eventually change hands. Every precedent eventually applies to someone else. And every tool you build in politics will someday be used by someone that you don't like very much. That is the nature of democratic government. And sometimes the quietest little machine in Washington ends up teaching the loudest lesson about how power really works. Now for this week's high note. There's a lot of noise about elections these days. It's hard to turn on conservative cable news or open social media for any more than a few seconds without hearing someone declare that democracy is collapsing and elections are rigged or stolen or at least dangerously compromised. Everyone seems to have a theory about elections. But here's the funny thing. The actual people who make elections work rarely show up on television. They're not politicians. They're not talking heads. They're not influencers screaming into microphones. They're volunteers sitting behind folding tables in school gyms and church basements. They're the people checking voter registrations. They're the people handing out ballots. They're the people patiently explaining to someone's confused uncle where to sign the form. In other words, they're the quiet infrastructure of democracy, and some of them have been doing it for an astonishing amount of time. Take Laura Wooten, for example. Laura Wooten was a poll worker in New Jersey for an incredible 79 years. Consecutive. Think about that for a second. 79 years. She started working at the polls in 1939. That means she helped run elections during World War II, the Civil Rights Movement, the Cold War, the dawn of the internet, basically every modern chapter in American history. She finally stopped in 2019 when she passed away at the age of 98. Nearly 8 decades of helping people vote. Not because it made her famous, not because it paid well, but because she believed the system mattered. Now, stories like that aren't actually rare, or as rare as you'd think. Across the country, election officials will tell you that a huge portion of poll workers are retirees who've been doing the job for years, sometimes decades. In Pennsylvania, there have been poll workers who have served their communities for generations. Local news in northeastern Pennsylvania once profiled a volunteer who had worked elections for more than 70 years. 70. Imagine the patience required for that. Imagine the dedication. That's thousands upon thousands of voters helped. Thousands of ballots checked. Thousands of moments where someone quietly made sure the process worked. And that's really the point here. For all the dramatic rhetoric surrounding elections and democracy in the United States, it doesn't run on speeches. It runs on people. Regular citizens who decide to show up and help. They set up voting machines before sunrise. They guide first-time voters through the process. They stay late counting ballots after everyone's gone home. And they do it because they believe the system only works if citizens participate in it. We actually got a glimpse of just how important these volunteers are during the pandemic. When COVID hit, many older poll workers understandably had to step back for safety reasons. Suddenly, election officials across the country realized something important. A huge portion of the election workforce had disappeared overnight. Counties scrambled to recruit younger volunteers because polling places literally couldn't operate without them. That's when a lot of Americans realized something they really hadn't ever thought about before. The machinery of democracy is incredibly ordinary. It's not mysterious. It's not hidden behind some secret curtain. It's run by neighbors, by retirees, by people who simply decide that helping others vote is worth a long day sitting at a folding table. Which brings us back to the spirit of that line you sometimes hear in civic circles. Democracy doesn't run itself. It runs because people like Laura Wooten spent 79 years making sure it worked. It runs because volunteers in Pennsylvania and across the country show up every election day to help their neighbors participate in the system. It runs because ordinary citizens believe that maintaining democracy is part of the job of being a citizen. And honestly, in a time when politics is utterly exhausting, there's something deeply reassuring about that. Because while politicians argue and the pundits shout, somewhere in America right now, there's probably a volunteer setting up a polling station, putting out the chairs, checking the voter list, making sure the machines work, not for attention, not for fame, just because they believe it matters. And that's a pretty good reminder that democracy isn't just something we argue about. It's something that we build together, one voter at a time. All right, everybody, thank you once again for downloading and listening to this episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. I would love to hear from you. I really, really want to hear from you. If you go to the website, www.neighborontheleft.com, you can find a contacts page that has all of the social media platforms that the podcast uses, as well as the email address that you can use. You can use any of those to contact, and I want to hear critiques. I want to hear compliments. I want to hear suggestions. I want to hear questions, whatever it is that you have. On the website, you can also find blog posts that mirror the topics of the episodes. And there is a page with a web player where you can actually download or listen streaming to any episode of the podcast going all the way back to the beginning. I'll be back on Friday with another installment of Back Porch Files. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and as always, have the kind of week you'd wish for others.